Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Without wasting any time, let's start today's Reddit story while playing Minecraft in background. I used to think that Sarah was the sister I never had, the kind of person who would literally bury a body with me if I asked, but looking back at the last 10 years of my life, I'm starting to realize she wasn't burying bodies for me. She was digging a grave for my entire future. You see, Sarah and I met in college during a particularly brutal sophomore year, and while everyone else was busy partying or drifting away, she was the one who stayed by my side through every breakup, every failed exam, and every family crisis. She was this steady one, the girl who would bring me soup when I was sick and sit on the phone with me for 4 hours while I cried about some guy who didn't text back, but I never stopped to ask why she seemed so happy whenever my life was falling apart. The realization didn't hit me all at once, because that's not how these things work, especially when you've built your entire social identity around a friendship that you think is unbreakable. It started about 6 months ago, right after Mark and I got engaged, which should have been the happiest time of my life. Mark is everything I ever wanted. He's a civil engineer, he's kind, he's patient, and he treats me like I'm the only person in the room. But the second he put that ring on my finger, the atmosphere between Sarah and me shifted in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. She smiled, she hugged me, and she even offered to be my maid of honor before I could even ask. But there was this look in her eyes, just for a split second, that felt like cold water hitting my back. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid, or that maybe she was just feeling a little bit left behind because she was still single and navigating the absolute nightmare that is modern dating in Chicago. I went out of my way to include her in everything from dress shopping to cake tastings, but the more I pulled her in, the more things started going wrong in ways that felt almost too coincidental to be bad luck. It started with the wedding venue, a beautiful historic loft we had saved up for months to secure, and Sarah had offered to handle the final confirmation call while I was stuck in a back-to-back meeting at the marketing firm where I work. When I called them the next day to pay the deposit, the coordinator told me that my assistant had called to say we were reconsidering the date because of a medical emergency in the family. I was confused, obviously, but Sarah just laughed it off when I asked her, saying there must have been a huge misunderstanding and that the coordinator probably got her notes mixed up with another bride. I believed her, because why wouldn't I? She was my best friend, the person who knew my deepest secrets and my darkest fears. But then the comments started filtering back to me from people I hadn't spoken to in years. My cousin Jenna called me out of the blue, sounding completely heartbroken, asking if I was doing okay with the news, and if there was anything her family could do to help with the treatments. I had no idea what she was talking about, and when I pressed her, she got really quiet and hesitant, eventually admitting that Sarah had told her at a mutual friend's baby shower that I had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of autoimmune disease. Sarah had apparently told her, with tears in her eyes, that I was trying to keep it a secret because I didn't want to ruin the wedding spirit, but that the prognosis was uncertain at best. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me, sitting there in my kitchen with a half-eaten salad, listening to my cousin describe a terminal illness that I didn't actually have. I confronted Sarah that night, and she burst into tears, claiming she had been talking about my stress-induced shingles from 3 years ago and that Jenna must have totally misinterpreted what she said. She was so convincing, so genuinely distraught that she had caused me pain, that I ended up apologizing to her for being so accusatory. That's the thing about people like Sarah. They make you feel like the villain for even noticing their knives in your back, and they do it with such a soft, helpful touch that you feel guilty for bleeding on their shoes. But the health rumors were just the tip of the iceberg, because as the wedding grew closer, Mark started acting differently, becoming more distant and preoccupied, and I could tell something was weighing on him that he wasn't telling me. We've always been big on communication, but every time I asked him if he was okay, he would just give me this look of profound sadness and tell me he was just stressed with work. It wasn't until I found a printed packet of medical documents in his desk drawer, documents that I had never seen before, listing symptoms and specialist recommendations for chronic conditions I didn't have, that I realized the scale of the deception. The papers looked official. They had the letterhead of a local hospital, and they were filled with notes about how my condition would likely make it impossible for me to ever have children or maintain a full-time career in the long run. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I had to sit on the floor, holding these forged documents in my shaking hands, realizing that someone was systematically trying to convince my future husband that I was a ticking time bomb of medical debt and infertility. My mind immediately went to Sarah, but I couldn't understand the why of it all, because she was the one who helped me pick out my flowers and helped me write my vows. Why would someone spend so much energy trying to destroy a person they claim to love? I decided right then that I wasn't going to confront her yet, not until I had proof that couldn't be explained away by a misunderstanding or miscommunication. So I started digging into the last few years of our friendship, looking at every setback I'd faced through a new, much darker lens. I remembered the promotion I lost out on 2 years ago, when my boss told me he was worried about my attendance and long-term reliability, despite me never missing a day of work. I remembered the guy I dated before Mark, who dumped me out of nowhere because he said he wasn't ready to be a caregiver, a comment that made no sense to me at the time, but now felt like a neon sign. Every time I had been on the verge of true success or lasting happiness, Sarah had been right there, whispering in the ears of the people who mattered most, painting me as a fragile, broken thing that needed to be handled with caution. It was a slow-motion assassination of my character and my future, and as I sat there in the dark of my office, I realized that the person I called my best friend was actually the greatest enemy I had ever known. The next few weeks were a masterclass in acting, as I had to pretend that everything was perfectly normal while I slowly dismantled the web of lies Sarah had spun around my life. It was exhausting, waking up every morning and putting on a smile for the woman who was actively trying to ruin my marriage, but I knew that if I tipped my hand too early, she would just find a way to flip the script and make me look like the unstable one again. I started by reaching out to the hospital on the letterhead I found in Mark's desk, and after a very long and frustrating series of phone calls, I confirmed what I already suspected. Those documents were complete forgeries, likely put together by someone with just enough knowledge of medical jargon to be dangerous. The hospital had no record of those specific tests or diagnoses, and the doctor whose name was at the bottom hadn't worked at that facility in over 5 years. I felt a strange mix of relief and pure, unadulterated rage, because knowing for sure that I wasn't crazy was one thing, but seeing the physical evidence of her malice was another. I needed to know how she got those papers to Mark, so I did something I'm not proud of. I looked through Mark's emails while he was in the shower. I found a thread from a burner account, an address that didn't have Sarah's name on it but used the exact same phrasing she always used in her texts, like, "just thought you should know," and "she's too proud to tell you the truth." The emails were framed as coming from a concerned friend who wanted to make sure Mark knew what he was getting into before he committed his life to someone who was hiding a debilitating illness. It was calculated, it was cruel, and it was designed to make Mark feel like I was the liar, not her. The most twisted part was how Sarah would come over for dinner and talk to Mark about our future kids, all while she was secretly telling him I could never have them. She would sit on my couch, drinking my wine, and look him in the eye with this sympathetic expression, probably waiting for the moment he would finally crack and leave me. I started to notice how she would subtly steer conversations toward health and legacy whenever we were all together, or how she would make little comments about how brave I was for working so hard despite my struggles. It was like watching a psychological thriller where I was the only one who knew who the killer was, and the tension was starting to make me feel like I was actually going to get sick for real. I decided to set a trap, something that would force her to reveal herself in a way that she couldn't wiggle out of, and I used the one thing she seemed most obsessed with, my perceived weakness. I told Sarah, in total confidence, that I had been feeling dizzy lately and that I was worried my condition was worsening, making sure to drop specific, fake details about a new medication I was supposedly taking. I knew that if she was truly the one behind the rumors, that information would make its way to Mark or my boss within 48 hours, and I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, my boss called me into her office, looking genuinely concerned, and asked if I needed to take an extended medical leave because she had heard from a reliable source that I was starting a high-risk treatment that would affect my cognitive functions. I didn't cry this time. I just looked at my boss and asked her exactly who told her that, and when she hesitated, I told her that I was being targeted by someone and that my legal counsel would be in touch to verify my actual medical records. The look of shock on my boss's face told me everything I needed to know. Sarah had called her, pretending to be my medical advocate, a title she had apparently given herself to gain access to my professional life. But the final straw came when Mark sat me down that evening, his face pale and his hands shaking, and told me that he thought we should postpone the wedding because he didn't think I was in the right headspace to be making life-altering decisions while I was so ill. He actually said the words, "Sarah told me you're starting the heavy meds tomorrow, and I just can't watch you go through this while trying to plan a party." I felt my heart break into 1,000 pieces, not because of what he said, but because of how much he clearly loved me and how much he was hurting because of her lies. He wasn't leaving me because he didn't want a sick wife. He was trying to protect me from the stress he thought was killing me. I pulled out the folder of evidence I had been gathering, the forged documents, the emails from the burner account, the logs of Sarah's calls to my office, and the clean bill of health from my actual doctor. We sat there for 3 hours as I walked him through every single lie, every single manipulation, and every single moment Sarah had tried to come between us over the last year. Mark went through a visible transformation, moving from confusion to disbelief and finally to a cold, hard anger that mirrored my own. He showed me the texts she had been sending him for months, things like, "She's having a bad day today, better not bring up the wedding," or "I saw her crying over the medical bills again, maybe you should handle the finances alone for a while." She had been isolating us from each other, creating a wall of secrets and concerns that made us feel like we were living in 2 different worlds. But we weren't done yet because Sarah still thought she was winning, and she was supposed to come over the next morning to help me with a seating chart. Mark and I didn't sleep that night. We just sat at the kitchen table, plotting the final confrontation, because I didn't just want her out of my life. I wanted her to understand that she had lost. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she had tried to do, and I wanted her to see the exact moment her best friend became the woman who would finally hold her accountable. The air in the apartment felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a massive storm, and as the sun started to peek over the Chicago skyline, I knew that by the end of the day, the Sarah I thought I knew would be gone forever. When Sarah showed up at 10 in the morning, she was carrying a bag of bagels and a special herbal tea she claimed would help with my inflammation, and she had this practiced, pitying smile on her face that made my skin crawl. She walked in like she owned the place, tossing her keys on the counter and immediately starting to talk about the guest list, completely oblivious to the fact that Mark was sitting in the corner of the living room, hidden from view by the high-back armchair. I let her talk for a few minutes, watching her perform the role of the devoted best friend, and it was honestly chilling to see how effortlessly she could lie to my face while pretending to care about my well-being. I finally interrupted her, mid-sentence about whether we should seat my judgmental aunt near the bar, and I just asked her point blank, "Sarah, why did you tell my boss I was starting high-risk medication today?" The silence that followed was deafening as the color slowly drained from her face, and she tried to maintain that mask of innocence. She started to do her usual routine, the wide eyes, the fluttering hands, the "oh my God, you must have misunderstood what I said to her." But I didn't let her finish. I pulled out the forged medical documents and laid them on the kitchen island, right next to her bag of bagels, and I saw the exact moment she realized she was caught. "These are fake, Sarah," I said, my voice surprisingly calm and steady. "The doctor isn't real, the diagnosis isn't real, and the burner email you used to send these to my fiancé isn't as anonymous as you thought it was." At that moment, Mark stood up from the chair and walked into the kitchen, his arms crossed and his face set in a look of pure disgust that I had never seen before. Sarah actually stumbled back a step, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, before she finally found her voice and tried one last, desperate pivot. She turned to Mark and said, "I was only doing it because I love her. She's been so stressed, Mark. She's not herself. I was just trying to help you both see that you're rushing into this." It was the most pathetic thing I had ever heard, a classic, "I did it for your own good" defense that only a true sociopath could come up with after being caught in a decade-long web of sabotage. Mark didn't even raise his voice. He just looked at her and said, "You tried to convince me that the woman I love was dying, so that I would leave her. You didn't do this for her. You did this because you couldn't stand the idea of her having something you don't." That hit her where it hurt, because Sarah's entire personality was built on being the better one, the one who was always there to pick up the pieces of my messy life, and without my misery to feed on, she had nothing. The confrontation turned ugly fast, as Sarah realized her manipulation wasn't working anymore and her sweet best friend persona completely evaporated, replaced by a snarling, bitter resentment that had clearly been simmering for years. She started screaming about how I didn't deserve Mark, how I was ungrateful for everything she had done for me, and how I would fall apart without her within a month. She admitted to the promotion sabotage, the previous breakups, and the rumors she'd spread to my family, justifying it all by saying she was protecting people from my supposed fragility. It was like watching a demon being exorcised, seeing all that ugliness pour out of her while she stood in my kitchen, surrounded by wedding planning binders and engagement photos. I told her to leave, and when she wouldn't, Mark had to physically guide her to the door while she was still shouting insults and threats. The last thing she said before the door slammed shut was that no one would ever love me the way she did, which is probably the most terrifying thing a person can say when they've spent years trying to ruin you. After she was gone, the apartment felt strangely quiet, like the air had finally cleared after years of being poisoned, and Mark and I just sat on the floor and held each other for what felt like hours. We were both exhausted, emotionally drained, and facing the reality that our entire social circle had been tainted by her lies. But for the first time in months, there were no secrets between us. The aftermath was messy, as you can imagine, because I had to go on a truth tour with my family, my boss, and our friends, explaining exactly what had happened without sounding like a crazy person myself. Most people were horrified and supportive, but there were a few who had been so thoroughly brainwashed by Sarah's concerns that it took a long time for them to see me as a healthy, capable adult again. My boss was incredibly apologetic and actually ended up giving me a raise to make up for the promotion I'd lost out on, and my cousin Jenna cried for an hour on the phone when she realized I wasn't actually dying. We decided to keep our original wedding date, but we moved the venue to a small, private estate and cut the guest list down to only the people who had stood by us through the Sarah storm. The wedding was beautiful, not because of the flowers or the food, but because it felt like a victory over someone who tried to steal my happiness before it even started. I still have moments where I wonder if someone is lying to me or if a helpful comment is actually a hidden blade, because that kind of betrayal doesn't just go away overnight. But then I look at Mark, and I remember that the person who was supposed to be my best friend tried everything in her power to break us, and she failed. Sarah moved to a different city a few months later, and I heard through the grapevine that she's already best friends with a new girl who's going through a tough divorce. I feel sorry for that girl, I really do, but I'm just glad that for the first time in 10 years, the story of my life is finally being told by me and me alone.